I remember saying to my mum, I'm going to step out of the family business. And it caused such a ruckus in my family because they're like, how could you do this to your mum? You have a duty to this family. You have to help support this family. Don't you believe in us? Don't you care about what we do? This is our survival here. And I said, no, I need to step away. If I didn't step away and the family business failed, it was going to take me down with it.
Before we get started on today's episode, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the land of the Darug people. We would like to acknowledge and pay respects to our elders past and present and the next generation coming through. Now, onto today's episode. Welcome to the Love Asian podcast. We're joined by Heaven Leigh today, a third-generation restaurateur and owner of Bodhi Restaurant Bar, a well-renowned plant-based Pan-Asian yum cha spot in Sydney. Heaven's grandparents ran the Lady Jade Chinese takeaway shops in Dundas Valley and Chatswood in the 60s, while her mother, Lee-Leng Whong, founded the original Bodhi concept in 1988, Australia's first yum cha restaurant. Heaven has always worked in the family restaurants from a young age and later in some of the best modern Asian restaurants overseas, including Hakkasan and Nobu. In this two-part episode, Heaven sits down with us to share her compelling story around the multi-million-dollar sacrifices she's made in order to support her family, her entrepreneurial mother, adversities she's faced, especially in the hospitality industry as a female, and how she's been able to transform Bodhi into the success it is today. We hope you enjoy this episode.
I guess the place to start usually, as you know, is really let's just wind it all the way back to childhood first, right? And I know we were like super excited when we were talking to you when we did like that little prep call that we did, and you had a lot to sort of unpack about childhood and how you basically grew up more in a Asian family setting as opposed to say a Western family setting. So do you want to sort of walk us through a little bit about what childhood was like for you, and obviously your mum being your mum and obviously being known in the industry as well. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Oh gosh, where do I start? It's a very long story. I hope we have time.
We have time.
So basically, I mean, my family came over here after the war in 1945 from Singapore and Malaysia with the Japanese. So that had a huge impact in my family. So it's kind of a very typical migrant story, but it's also got a lot of different points to it as well. My mother came over. She came over to New Zealand first before she came to Sydney. So she got she was sponsored to go to New Zealand to university, and then she came over here and brought over my grandparents and her 7 siblings. So we had a really, really big family.
Huge family.
Okay. Huge family. And she brought each of them over, helped get them educated, put them through businesses as well, and all of that kind of stuff. So my mum was that sort of.
Was she the oldest?
She's the oldest.
Oh,
of course.
So she had
There's that sense of responsibility. She was the oldest child and I was the oldest grandchild.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we've always had that sense of responsibility in that family through mum and I. So she brought all of her siblings over and put them through school. And I think that we were quite lucky because we landed in a pretty good area. So whether it was by design or by accident, my mum decided to stay in the North Shore area, so Hornsby, Wahroonga sort of suburbs. And there were good points and bad points to that. So the good points were it was a very affluent sort of suburb, although we didn't have the biggest house. We were probably the smallest house on the street of big houses. And there were, the mentality of the people there, the schools, the education system was very different. So we had a lot of opportunity, but there were some bad points to it, which is there weren't a lot of other people like us in the area. So my aunts were the first Chinese students at Hornsby Girls High School. They didn't have any other kids to relate to. And my youngest auntie is actually only 10 years older than me. So she's almost like an older sister.
Wow.
So there's quite a narrow generational gap.
Yeah.
I almost sometimes feel like I'm part of their generation as opposed to the next generation. And then the youngest of my generation is, I think 17, 18 now.
Still very young.
Yeah, maybe 18,
And how
19.
old was your mum when she had you?
30.
Oh, so she wasn't that like sort of early as well.
No, so
she's got a big gap between her sisters.
Yeah,
her
she's
siblings.
got quite a big gap between her younger sister and herself, basically. From the North Shore, we've still got family that live there, basically. My grandparents stayed out that way the whole time. So that was our experience coming to Australia. It was a bit different from a lot of other people's. We didn't assimilate into a very strong Chinese sort of area. So, whether it's places like Parramatta or Cabramatta or, Chinatown, although we had businesses out there, we sort of stuck to the North Shore area.
And I guess, like, what were your memories of childhood? Being in that environment, like you said, there weren't that many people that you could relate to. And was it tough?
Yeah, it was. Although my immediate family never made me feel like an outsider. I still felt like an outsider. So there was a lot of issues for me growing up in sort of the North Shore area because of racism, because there weren't a lot of other Asian kids like me. So I'd had to deal with a lot of things like you're a half caste, you're a half breed, those sort of terms were thrown around a lot in the 70s. So I didn't feel like I quite identified with my Asian side, and I didn't quite feel like I fit in with my Western side. We would travel a lot when I was a kid. We lived in Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, because my mum was a single parent working. And so I would often have to go with her for a year, 2 years at a time. And I have really distinct memories of going back to Singapore and Malaysia and the kids giving me a really hard time because I wasn't Asian enough. And I would argue with them and say, I am Asian. And then I'd come back to Australia and the kids would be like, oh, you're Asian. And I'm like, I'm white. So, I didn't quite feel like I fit into either side. But my Asian side of the family brought me up. So I had a very strong Chinese identity with my grandparents, and I spoke Hokkien. My Mandarin's okay. My Cantonese is abysmal. I can say a couple of really good swear words because I worked in a kitchen with restaurants, but that's about it. But those are my sort of memories of growing up on the North Shore, of not quite fitting in. And then I also remember I have very distinct memories of my grandparents in business. So they were in the food industry. They had takeaway shops, Chinese takeaway shops in Dundas and in Chatswood. And so I would my grandfather would put me on a sack of rice in the corner of the kitchen where I would watch my family cook and talk and gossip and I would watch them serve customers over the counter at Chatswood Station. So that's kind of what I remember, the smells, the movement, the togetherness of family working towards a common goal of trying to succeed or get out of poverty sort of thing.
Yeah, wow.
And your mum is obviously very well known in the space of being like a very prolific restaurateur, right, as well. So you mentioned she did a fair bit of traveling and that sort of stuff. Was that sort of in the same industry, or what was she doing when she was moving around?
She started out when she first came to Australia, she started out as a model. She was very exotic and unusual. So she did a little bit of modelling, nothing serious. And then she became a journalist. So she was the first Chinese journalist to work for Rupert Murdoch here in Australia. She worked for News. She worked for Financial Review, so papers like that. Actually, a little while ago, my husband actually did a secondment with News Limited. And I asked him to go into the archives to try and find some of the old articles that she'd written. And so he pulled all of this stuff out, and I've got sort of photos, and I presented them to my mum years later. Because I also remember as a small child, I used to play on the newsroom floor, on the cutting room floor, where they would actually put the papers together like they did in the old days, not like today. And I'd hide under the sports reporters' tables and stuff and play around because we didn't have a lot of childcare back then. So either your grandparents looked after you or you had to go to work. You really didn't have a choice, and you'd have to hide somewhere so that the bosses didn't see you kind of thing, or you stayed out of the way. But yeah, so she started in journalism, and some of those articles that we found, in one of them, which I thought was quite interesting, there's a picture of her with a rickshaw, holding a rickshaw, and there was some famous sports person in the back of the rickshaw that the article was about. So it was a very, like they typecast her as that sort of exotic Asian sort of beauty sort of thing. So she went into journalism, became a press secretary for some really well-known business characters in Australia, like Lee-Meng Whong, who owns like Enercon car parks and a whole bunch of other things. And then she was the press secretary for John Aquilina, who was a minister in Parliament at the time. So we had a few political connections in our family. And then she was a serial entrepreneur on top of that. She helped my family start a clothing business. They worked for Ken Dunn, who was a great Australian artist at the time, making all of the clothes for them. She had her own clothing store in Neutral Bay, and then she also helped my grandparents with, the takeaway shops and stuff. And then eventually she opened her own restaurant, which was the first Bodhi.
Serial entrepreneur. Wow.
I think it was just in the blood.
Yeah. Do you think you get that tendency from her as well?
100%.
Yeah.
100%. I think I get my savviness from my father and the political side of my family. And I think I get my serial entrepreneurial mind and problem solving from my mother's side of the family.
So growing up, I don't know if this is too sensitive to talk about, but with your dad's side of the family, were you quite involved with them, or is it more of your mum's side?
No, I was 100% in with my mum's side of the family. They're the people that raised me. I didn't really have much to do with my dad's side of the family. So I didn't have a lot of influence in that area.
Right.
So as much as people would say, oh, you're very westernized, I felt like I wasn't, because I didn't have that influence at home. We spoke Chinese at home. We ate Chinese food at home as much as I wanted McDonald's as a kid because I didn't want anything Asian. I wanted to fit in with the Australian kids. But no, I definitely relate more to the Chinese side of my family than the Western side.
The other thing that came to mind when you were talking about it and you sort of growing up in the restaurant scene, so to speak, was the restaurant business can be very male dominated, particularly in the kitchen, right?
Yeah.
So as say we'll call it Wasian, someone who's sort of mixed race, and then also being female, and then being the daughter of, say the restaurant owner in your mum's case, or even say your relatives. Were there any sort of like stories or anything like that you sort of experienced, or what was it like, I guess? Because I know it can be quite full of testosterone, let's just call it that, and
look, it was quite difficult. I think, although I have to say thank you to my mum, because she had the sort of mentality. I always like to say my mum was the kind of person that broke glass ceilings and bamboo ceilings. She was the kind of person that didn't know the word no, like, I'm just going to do it. I don't care what anyone else says. So I think I learned a lot of that from her. But I do remember when she first started the Bodhi, people saying, you can't do this. You can't make it. Number one, it's vegetarian. Number two, you're a woman. You've never run a restaurant before. You have no idea what you're doing. But she was just like, well, why can't I do it? I like to eat. Everybody else wants to eat. We should just make food. So, she just kind of just went out and did it. There wasn't a you can't, you shouldn't in her own mind. So I had a really great template to follow from that aspect, although I don't think I recognized it at the time. It's only been as I've gotten older that I can look back in hindsight and say, wow, that was quite impressive what she did. But I do remember that it was very difficult for her, particularly in the yum cha side of the industry. That is super male dominated. And it's a real... almost like, I'm not going to say mafia. That's probably the wrong term, but it could be used, loosely. It's almost very unionized, the yum cha industry. It's very controlled. The wages are very controlled. The methodologies of how they do things is very controlled. And everybody knows what's going on in each other's businesses. So I think it was tough for her to try and break that yum cha monopoly and to try and do things the Australian way. And I don't think she ever really succeeded in that. It took sort of my generation coming in to make those changes work in the dim sum industry. And there was also, like I've always said, a little racism as well, because, I remember listening to the chefs using terms about me and accusing me of being, super white or not understanding because I don't love Chinese and I don't like Chinese people or Chinese food. And I'm like,
right? That
makes no sense. Because I'm like, I'm Chinese. How do I not like my own people? Like, I don't get it, sort of thing. There were a lot of naysayers and a lot of doubters, and you just have to keep putting one foot forward in front of the other and not listen to everybody outside of yourself. And you have to have this tenacity and self-belief that I don't care what anyone else says. I know this is going to work. I can do it.
So then going from your mum opening her first Bodhi restaurant and then to you and your generation taking over, what happened, or I guess how did that happen? And did she open any other restaurants in between?
Yeah, so because Mum was a serial entrepreneur, I don't think she could help herself. Anytime and she was also an opportunist. So anytime something would come up, she would be like, oh, yes, let's go and do that. So people would start offering her venues and locations. And she's like, oh, that looks good. Let's open a business there. I'm like, we don't need another business. Who's going to run it, Mum? She's looking at me like, hey, you could come into the family business. And I'm like, I don't want to do restaurants, you know. But so she would go and open all of these places, and often it would fall to me to have to go in and help to manage and to run them. Between the both of us, we had 7 venues across Sydney, which was quite a few.
Yeah.
And it got to be too much, you know. And we started to diversify in areas that I didn't feel were true to our core message. So, you know, she opened a convenience store at Central Station. I'm like, why are you opening a convenience store at Central Station? But there was a method to her madness. I asked her once, why did you do that? Because I never really understood it. And she said, well, when I used to buy stock, I used to have to pay a certain price for it. So if I opened a convenience store, they gave me massive discounts.
Right?
So it was all tactical.
Yes.
So then it made sense in her mind. But I'm like, who opens a restaurant, then a convenience store to get cheaper goods? But that's what she did.
Asian parents tend to do things where they don't explain it to you, but it's in their head.
It's in their head, right? They have a method. You just don't know what that method is.
You don't know what's going on.
And maybe even sometimes they don't know how to explain that method to you either. So yes, there was it was some interesting times. But I thought, look, we had sort of diversified into too many different things, you know, homewares, cafes, convenience store. And I just said, look, we've got to reduce what we're doing and bring it back to the core of what we do really, really well. And I felt there was a lot of resistance in my family to do that. So I had this really interesting period of time in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s. You know, Mum had done incredibly well at her business, but it was starting to suffer. There were cracks that were showing. And she wasn't willing, maybe because of a sense of pride, to share with me or anyone else in the family what was going on. And those cracks were getting bigger and bigger. I think I kind of knew something was happening, but I didn't know exactly what was happening. And so around the late 90s, I mean, we had gone through, you know, recessions around that time. We'd survived a recession. The GST had just been introduced. A lot of businesses faltered during the GST period. And I knew something was wrong, but she wasn't willing to tell me what it was. So I remember saying to my mum, I'm going to step out of the family business. I'm going to take a step away. And it caused such a ruckus in my family because they're like, how could you do this to your mum? You know, you have a duty to this family. You have to help support this family. Don't you believe in us? Don't you care about what we do? This is our survival here. And I said, no, I need to step away. And I had my own method for that, methodology behind that. And that was, if I didn't step away and the family business failed, it was going to take me down with it. At least if I stepped away, I was able to distance myself financially. I could start again. If they had to declare bankruptcy or anything like that happen, I could still come in and work back into it, sort of thing. But they didn't quite understand that at the time. So I took a little bit of a step back from the business. There's this thing when you have a multi-generational family-run business, it's very hard for the older generation to give way to the next generation. They get very stuck in their ways. And they have a belief system of this is how it should be run. This is what we've done to date and this is what's worked for us. Now, you know, people change, the tastes of people change. You have to evolve from a business side of things. If you don't evolve constantly, you're going to be dead in the water in 10 years' time. And unfortunately, a lot of the older generation don't know how to evolve. And the younger generation come in with these new ideas and, you know, why don't we do this? And this is what my generation wants and so forth. And the older generation don't quite get it. And they think, oh, you're still a kid. You know,
there's a clash.
Yeah, and there becomes this big clash. I see it in so many different businesses where they don't know how to let go of the reins for the next generation to take over. They haven't established that trust yet that the kids are going to make the right fiscal decisions for the long-term success of the company. And we had that exact problem in our family as well. And so in the early 2000s, when my mum was almost, you know, done and out of the business because we were losing money hand over fist, I said to her, I'll come back in, but I'll come back in on one condition: you need to step out. And that created a whole nother.
What was that conversation like?
That was tough. That was 6 months of tears and fighting and I'm never going to speak to you again. And, you know, I mean, it was the worst period of our lives, of our relationship. I don't think any child should ever have to see a parent go through that sort of financial desperation. And it was definitely one of the
That's a massive bruise on her ego, right?
Yes.
Like that was I feel like if I was in her position, that would be the thing. It would be like,
this is the dragon
it'd be
lady,
the acceptance that I failed.
Yeah.
Right? And my daughter's got to come and swoop in essentially and
save face.
Well, I got to save and face, we can talk about that for ages, but my daughter has to come in and clean up my mess, so to speak.
And I think there's parts of her that still don't accept that to this day as well. There are moments when I think she does think, oh gosh, yes, I couldn't have come through that. And then there are other times when we've talked about it where she's very conveniently changed some of the history and the narrative and rewritten the story a little bit. Sorry, Mum. But I think I had to come back in and sort of say to her, if I'm going to make the sacrifices that it's going to take to pull this company out of the position that it's in, I need to know that you're going to let me have free and creative reign to take the business to where I believe it can go and needs to go. But it took a long time. And I said to her, we'll do this as gently as possible. You want to come in every day, you can still come in. You want to count the money, you can count the money, it's important that she still felt valued because I recognised that was the thing that she was afraid of as well, of not having a importance anymore. So I said, you can still come in, but I need you to let me make the big decisions from this point. So, around 2001 too, that's sort of when
how did she I'm curious about that conversation or like that series, because you said it took 6 months. And I'm thinking back now.
That's just for the conversation,
well, that was
right?
the conversation.
That's just the conversation. The process took 2 years after that, but the conversation was 6 months.
See, I think about the fact my parents used to own a supermarket for about 7 years. It was like an IGA out in Riverwood. And I was probably too young. I was sort of like in, year 10. So probably just didn't have that sort of business nous at that stage. I was like faffing about doing whatever and worrying about, girls. But, I think about now retrospectively what I could have done to help my parents with their business, because they very similarly were bleeding cash in a lot of ways. They had a nightmare landlord. They couldn't get things signed off for, fridges breaking down and freezers and trying to get things done. And having that hard conversation, I can't imagine that. So how difficult that process would have been for you and your mum, because it's not only business, it's personal, right?
Yeah.
In probably even a bigger way than the actual business side of things as well.
This episode is produced and brought to you by Social Wave. Social Wave is a strategic content marketing agency helping businesses grow revenue using video, podcasts, and SEO. Head on over to socialwave.com.au to find out more. Now back to the show.
There are probably people listening who have many family businesses.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that repelled me away from the business was the fact to see how hard they worked. I don't want to get into anything like this. And yet you were very interested and wanting to come back and help. What were some of the things that helped you work this out with your mum to be able to then take the next steps to then,
I had to make a lot of promises.
Right.
I had to make a lot of financial promises. I had to give her a lot of security and say to her, look, if I'm going to put my name to your debt, we were talking at the time, I was in my early 20s. Yeah. This was millions of dollars of debt that they had accumulated. And I was dealing with the tax department and all of this kind of stuff. Like, they were really behind. And I said, if I'm going to put my name to this debt, if I'm going to help pay all of this off, it's going to take me a long time. To do that, like I said, you're going to need to sort of step back, because we were clashing on decisions on how to do things. Like, I wanted to modernize. I wanted to bring in cocktails. I wanted to have modern food. They wanted to stick to this very traditional way of doing it. It was such a long and slow conversation because she had to process it, right? So I had to kind of lay it out. We had to fight about it. I had to step away. She had to see this problem wasn't going away and it wasn't getting solved. There was a period of time in that couple of years where I stepped in and helped, and we started to see the problem improve. And so I had to step away again. I almost had to say, well, that's it, I'm done, and step out. I couldn't threaten it anymore. I had to sort of see that through. And by stepping out, the debt started to accumulate again. Okay. So, eventually she could see that there was this correlation between my daughter's involved in the business and running it, and it's doing better. When she's not involved, it's not doing as well.
It's almost like you have to prove what
I had to prove that a little bit. For us, there was also a turning point. So I remember coming into the Bodhi, a lot of people don't know this story, but I came into Bodhi one day and there was a security guard standing outside my front door. I said, what's going on here? And the council was our landlord at the time. And the security guard said, I'm sorry that you're locked out of the premises. You need to go and contact Sydney City Council. So I contacted the council because at the time, the way the business was designed was I would go in and run certain shops. So Cook and Phillip Park was always my baby. I had started it. It was my concept. And I would sort of send all the money to head office. I'd take a small wage, but mostly everything went back to head office. And the finances were then distributed amongst all the other businesses. And I didn't have a lot of clarity on how that was happening. So when I turn up at work one day and there's a security guard saying, you haven't paid rent in almost 2 years.
Oh, shit.
You know, which meant my mum, my whole
2
office.
years?
Almost 2 years. They hadn't paid rent properly. And you have a huge debt with them. I was like, what?
What do you mean?
What do you mean we haven't been paying the rent? I was flabbergasted. And the turning point was at the time I was dating a guy whose dad was an ex-bank manager for St. George. And I spoke to him and I asked him for some advice on how to sort of deal with this. And I went and called Sydney City Council and I said, look, can I call a meeting? And we went and had this big meeting. And I remember going into this meeting, there was legal representation for Sydney City Council. I mean, there must have been about 10 people from the council side in the room. I mean, it was ridiculous. And there was me, my mum, and my ex's father, you know, who had come in to just give a little bit of advice. And I walked in and I sat in on that meeting, and it was one of those things where my gut instincts just kicked in. And I looked around this room and I thought, my God, we're never going to get anywhere with this. And there was a gentleman that was sitting across the table. I didn't know who was who at that meeting, right? They sort of didn't really introduce themselves apart from we're from council. But I identified that this is the person that's making the decisions. My gut instinct said, this is the guy I need to be speaking to. Forget everybody else. Just look at him. Just talk to him in the room. And my mum was sitting next to me and she sort of had this plan of how she was going to ask for mercy and how do we get through this? And because we needed to reopen our doors to be able to trade our way out of the debt. And I looked at him and I don't know where this came from, but I just said to him, look, you've got two choices here. I'm either going to declare bankruptcy tomorrow and you're not going to get a cent, or you're going to reopen those doors and allow me to trade my way out of this debt and I will pay you off in 2 years.
Wow.
And he said, put a business plan together and come to my office by tomorrow morning. So I stayed up all night and I put this business plan together on how we were going to sell off some of our businesses. You know, caveats were put on our family home, all of that sort of stuff. And my mum was like, what are you saying? What are you doing? And I said, Mum, shut up. Just trust me. Just trust me on this. And she went quiet. And it's probably the first time in her life that she's ever gone. I think she recognized this was a turning point moment for us as well. And I walked into that office the next day and I sat down with this gentleman and I explained my position. I explained where we were at, what we were willing to do, what we were willing to pay off immediately, and how he would have to work with us to get us to a position where we could pay off every dollar. And he agreed to it. He agreed to everything that I proposed, and that's how we kind of came back from near extinction.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I remember when you told me that story and I was just so in awe, but in shock as well about how much you had to carry during that time. You speak about it with so much courage, but were you shitting yourself?
Yeah, 100%. You know, like you don't know how you're going to get through this. It was one of those I'm on the floor moments and I don't know how to get up and get on the next day. Like, I just don't know if I'm going to survive this. I don't know if my family will survive this. I don't know if my relationship with my mother will survive this. Like, why did you hide so much from me? Why didn't you let me know what was going on earlier? Why don't you trust me to help sort of navigate through all of this stuff? You know, so it was one of those moments in your life where you just kind of go, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can go on.
Where's the persistence come from? Because I know a lot of people who would probably just be like, oh, forget about it. Let's just pack it all up and like declare bankruptcy, right? That's just the easier out. But then why were you like, no, like we can make this work and I'll stay up all night, do the business plan and then trade our way out of it? Because 2 years is a long time, obviously, or however long it took. Where was the thinking behind? Or was it just like one day at a time? It was just like one foot in front of the other, right?
Yeah, one day at a time, 1 foot in front of the other. And I think also, and this has only just occurred to me now, the thing that also was driving me was if I do this, not only will I secure my family, but I will also get my freedom down the track. if I don't do this effectively, my family, I'm going to have to go and get a job working for someone else. I don't know if my mum, she's much older now, she's not going to be able to go back into the workforce. That responsibility is going to fall on me. And I don't know if I'm going to do as well, because at the time I didn't want to do restaurants, right? I had studied a bit of film production, so I wanted to break into that sort of area. That was my creative passion outside of restaurants that I wanted to do. And I didn't know if I would be paid enough to support my family, basically. So I knew I had to do something that would be able to bring in the finances to support them and to pay off that debt. And there's no way I can do that getting a job working for someone else. The only way to do that is through business at the end of the day, where fortunes are made and lost. So it was a combination of, I've got to get through this. I don't have a choice. You just have to pick yourself up. And that's a very migrant story, by the way, of we had to open a business because we needed to survive. We were not employable in, corporate and all of that kind of stuff. We didn't have the education. We didn't have the documentation to say we could be doctors or this, that, and the other, even if we had in our own countries. So I think that there's a tenacity to migrants, that came through, number one. And number two, there was a sense of, if I do this, how many years until I can get my freedom back?
So do you feel like you had a choice growing up, let's just say like from high school right through to, sort of in your 20s, that you were like, no, I had to be in the business because, you were so intertwined with everything that even if you wanted to go out and do, media and film and all that sort of stuff, there was always this cloud hanging behind your head. Because I'm like, there's just this sort of like shadow behind you that's following you around all the time with this. So it was almost like I read it as no choice. It was just like you had to do it.
It felt like that. I think there was a period, like I left school very early. I dropped out of school. I actually never even completed my high school education. I had tried my hand at a few different things, but I was a bit of a lost kid. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what my identity was. I didn't feel like I belonged. I was a black sheep. So I didn't, and I didn't know what I wanted to do from a very young age. And there was a lot of pressure in my family. You either had to succeed in sort of a career or profession, like doctors, accountants, all of that kind of stuff, or you had to succeed in business. And if there's already a family business, you come into the family business and you are responsible. After I finish off, eventually when I'm 103, you will get to take over the business and that will be yours. And that's my legacy. So there was a lot of pressure. I mean, I remember my mum gave me my first cafe when I was 17, 18 years of age because she thought I was just a lost cause and this was a way to bring me back into the fold.
Play with this.
And I didn't want it. I was like, I don't want it. I was incredibly ungrateful. I was like, I don't want it. I don't want to have anything to do with it. I don't want hospitality. Although I ended up being very good at it, it wasn't something that I wanted to do. So with Bodhi, when I opened that one, I only wanted to go into hospitality if it would be the kind of restaurant that I know that I would want to go to, that sort of thing. And there was passion there. I don't want to say that it was all like, no, I hated it, I didn't like it. There was passion there for what we did. Like I love taking the basic concept of what my mum created and turning that round and making that successful. So that journey part is what really fascinates me. And then I love also that shared experience of food and bev and bringing people together and what connects us as humans and Asians and non-Asians and all of that kind of stuff. But there definitely was a sense of this is not fair. I'm having to give up what I want to do in my life to fix the problems or to stay and solve, this huge issue that we were having. There was a period of resentment that I had as well, where I kind of railed against my family and I was just very bitter about how I lost the opportunity to pursue my dreams. I had lived in London for a period of time and I'd sort of been offered a job working in television production and I walked away from that job to come back and salvage this business. And I resented them for that. There was a period that I did that, but that changed. Because I think naturally I'm not the kind of person that's super negative anyway. So I sort of had to say to myself, well, you can sit here and be a victim and you can blame everybody else for your circumstances or your situation, or you can turn this around and find the joy in what you do and find the things that excite you and make this, a great and interesting journey and celebrate that. And I feel like I had this sort of full circle moment, once I started to see success come through, I was like, yes, I can do this. This is great.
It's like a high, right? Like a dopamine.
Yeah,
hit.
you start to sort of, feel really good about what you're doing. And actually the success that I found in restaurants and business, it actually allowed me and funded me to do the things that I'd wanted to do. Sure, I didn't work in television production the way I wanted to be. I didn't become David Attenborough, which was the dream sort of thing. But I did get to do other projects that were still in the same vein, that were self-funded, where nobody was telling me that I have to do this, that, the other. I could do whatever I wanted because I could afford to do whatever I wanted. So, you've got to find the joy and the things that make you happy in what you do.
Yep.
And then you've got to exploit that and know that even if you've had to walk away from your dreams are still possible. It just might come in a different format down the track.
I've been going to Bodhi for years and years and years now, but I remember seeing, like, when I subscribed to the newsletter, over the years, the style of it changed, and I could see that there was one photo shoot that you did where I think it was like a tea party.
Yes.
And just the concept of that, and you spoke about how, I think somewhere in the notes that you said it was a photographer helping your dreams come true, essentially. Yeah. Is that something that you were exploring, and how you were mentioning the funding to be able to create things that you wish you could have done? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I'd always had this sort of creative side. So, and yum cha is not traditionally a pretty food. If you Google yum cha photos, they're not the greatest.
Browns and yellows.
Yeah, lots of browns, lots of yellows, lots of steamed baskets with oil on them and stuff like that. So it's not traditionally known as a pretty food. And I'm like, what would yum cha look like? What's the fantasy of what yum cha could look like? Like, it's these gorgeous little small delicacies, and to me it was almost like this sort of this tea party fantasy, almost like a high tea party fantasy. It's the Asian version of high tea. I mean, let's be honest.
Yes.
So let's take that high tea sort of image and let's combine that with the yum cha food and see what we get. And that's what we did, sort of thing. So that was the first thing, and that was fun. I was like, okay, so I can actually now start to do things in a totally different way from how every other yum cha restaurant does it, and I can present it in a different way. And not only that, I can take the best of my Eastern heritage and my Western upbringing, and I can bring those things together. And I think that started to resonate with people, where they were like, oh, I never looked at it this way, And so from there, it kind of started to grow.
Going off of when you said you started taking over Bodhi and adding your own identity into it and growing it to be as successful as it was, you've had a lot of celebrities come into the restaurant, and you've had a lot of people celebrate weddings, anniversaries, etc. How did you build the business to become the success that it was?
Always listening to what my customers wanted was important, but not designing my business 100% around what the customers wanted, right? You still have to stay true to who you are and the core of what you do. I think I had enough belief in what it was that I was trying to create, and knowledge that it would resonate, sort of thing. So that was really helpful. Always listening to them, because, they would give you good feedback. But you also have to be very careful. You don't want to take on every single piece of criticism. If you try and be all things to everybody, you're actually nothing to anyone either. So you've got to you've got to learn how to sort of take out the true sort of, I want you to do better, and so I'm giving you this feedback, as opposed to the I'm just going to criticize you and complain. I'm leaving a bad review and I'm complaining because I had to pay for car parking and babysitter and I didn't have a good experience, sort of thing. So, and you have to also learn not to take things too personally. So when I first sort of got involved in businesses, I used to take everything personally, because this was my baby. This is my creativity on display. And if you have a bad experience, that's me. You're criticizing me. It's not. You're never going to make everybody happy at the end of the day. So, it's important that you forget trying to please everybody, but that you still have to recognize that you've still got to please a great deal of people for it to be successful, kind of thing. So it's that balance.
How long did it take to, obviously going back to sort of like, sort of coming, picking yourself up from the floor and then turning around Bodhi as well? Because, I've got a note here really and it's really meta in the sense that, your mum felt a loss of identity sort of stepping away from the restaurant, and then you yourself becoming a mum as well. And then sort of not working in the restaurant as much as well. So did you feel like you struggled with that when Bodhi sort of turned around, and, what was that like, sort of being a mum?
Yeah, definitely. You go through periods in your life where you feel like you have a loss of identity. I felt like I had a loss of identity when I first took over the business. Then I felt like I had a loss of identity. I mean, I felt like that when I was a child as well, because I didn't know who I was, you know, and I didn't know which culture I belonged in. I felt like I had a loss of identity again, you know, when I had kids. And then again, you know, in closing the business recently, I went through this wobbly moment of, oh my God, who am I? You know, when this has been tied so closely to my identity for so long, when your career has been, you start to go, well, what am I without this? But I also think that those are the times in life that are the most exciting, because you know, not only do you get to rediscover yourself, and you just have to be open to it, but you also get to redesign yourself and your life. So all the things that weren't working, you can go, do you know what? I'm going to let go of that stuff, and I'm just going to focus on the things that were working. And I'm going to add this new stuff in that I've always wanted to add in, and I've never had the space and the time to be able to do, because I've been so caught up in this sort of business or whatever it is that you do, or passion that you do. So yeah.
Thanks for listening to part 1 of this episode with Heaven Leigh. Make sure you tune into next week's episode for part 2, where we discuss the details behind Bodhi's closure, and we get to hear about what's in store for the future of Bodhi.